This is KVR, Kaijuvision Radio, Episode 42, Battle in Outer Space. Hello, kaiju and tokusatsu fans, and welcome to Kaijuvision Radio, a podcast about the appreciation of kaiju and tokusatsu movies and discovering their historical and cultural value. I'm Brian Scherschel.
And I'm Daniel DiManna.
Thank you again, Daniel, for coming on to the show again. This is a really good movie, and I can see why you'd want to come on.
Absolutely. This is actually one of my very all-time favorite films that Toho's ever done in general, monster or not. So I'm ecstatic to come and talk about this movie.
Daniel is the Godzilla Novelization Project. He is at GodzillaNovelizationProject.wordpress.com. Definitely check that out. It's amazing.
Thank you.
I just have one small update regarding the feedback at Kaijuvision.com email address. If you emailed and you didn't get a reply from me, it is because I was not able to receive those emails for a time. So if you sent me something and I didn't reply to you, then send me something again, because there was a little bit of a mess up with the routing of that email address. So we apologize for that, but get a hold of me if you were not able to before. In this episode, we will be covering the 1959 film Battle in Outer Space. The literal translation of the Japanese title Uchu Daisenso is Great Space War. The related topic for this episode is the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. A short description of the film is next. It is Kaijuvision's textbook perfect way to describe the film, not do a plot synopsis, but describe everything about this great film, and then we can get the facts out of the way, and we can continue on to our opinion and discussion section. You're listening to KVR, Kaijuvision Radio. The Nataral are a technologically advanced alien race. Their goal is to launch successful attacks on humanity and to invade Earth. They want to thwart human efforts to develop weapons and technology that can thwart or match theirs. Major Ishiro Tsuchiya is a resolute and capable astronaut who plays a leading role in the defense of Earth. Iwamura is a dedicated and loyal astronaut in the Earth expedition to the Moon. His loyalty is reversed when the Nataral put him under mind control. Dr. Adachi is an earnest, brilliant, and well-disciplined professor who is determined to stop the alien invasion. Etsuko Shirayashi is a courageous astronaut who develops a relationship with Major Kitsumiya. The plot is unified because everything the humans do has to do with the Nataral. The Nataral are the problem. The humans send two spaceships called Speeps to the Moon. They use plutonium-powered heat ray weapons to eliminate the Nataral presence on the Moon, but that's not all of them. The problem is solved when the humans repel the invasion force. They use atomic heat cannons and space fighter planes to destroy hostile flying saucers and the mothership. The story by Jojiro Okami and the screenplay by Shinichi Sekizawa is simple, fast-paced, and focused on action. The characters are drawn relatively thin. Okami also wrote the story for the Mysterians. The original idea was to create a direct sequel to The Mysterians, with many of the same actors reprising their roles, but that was not feasible. Budget figures for this film are unavailable, but you can tell that the production values are likely above average. Special effects were directed by Eiji Tsuburaya. He and the effects team utilized a wide variety of methods to create the futuristic alien invasion scenario. The special effects all look good. It appears as though a great amount of care was used in the creative process. Ukifube composed an appropriately futuristic soundtrack to complement the film's sci-fi flavor. It is filmed in Tohoscope and has stereophonic sound. The tone of the movie is serious, and there is plenty to lose in this conflict, which results in a moderate amount of gravity. Though this was written by Sekizawa, there is not much textbook Sekizawan humor. The film has more of a sci-fi flavor to it than The Mysterians, though it still has elements of fantasy. Battle in Outer Space is not an experimental film because it was planned as a sequel to The Mysterians. It's more of a film that does everything well, which was not common in sci-fi films at the time. It is notable that much of this movie takes place in space, and that this is the first moon landing in a Toho tokusatsu film. The film reinforces the style of 1957's The Mysterians with its alien invasion and sci-fi trappings. The movie was made to tap into the same sci-fi loving audience that enjoyed The Mysterians, kaiju films, and other American sci-fi films like Forbidden Planet. The film was released on December 26, 1959 in Japan. The film was reasonably successful, though not as successful as The Mysterians. It grossed 123 million yen, or about 2.3 million present-day dollars. Columbia Pictures acquired it for release in America, which was then dubbed by Bellucci Productions. It was the first Toho sci-fi movie to be released in America without parts being cut or added in. It was released in the U.S. on July 8, 1960. The film is rated 5.7 on that movie database. Though it doesn't have a kaiju in it, this movie is still relatively well known and liked in the tokusatsu and kaiju fan communities. There are a couple of forces at play. The Natarl concentrate on having a technological advantage over humanity, and once they lose that advantage, they are defeated. The Natarl turn humans against each other through mind control, so the Natarl cause division while the humans eliminate division. Director Ishiro Honda's trademark Brotherhood of Man theme has a huge level of significance to this story, as the humans follow this philosophy in every action they take, unless they're under mind control. They unite in common cause to do what they must do to defend themselves. They work as a team to solve problems, they pool their scientific expertise and resources, and they optimistically create a better future. The film communicates to the audience some of the amazing possibilities of the spaceflight era. There are many challenges out there, but there's nothing we can't do if we put our minds to it and work together. That concludes part 1. You're listening to KVR, Kaijuvision Radio. Part 2 of the podcast is the opinion and discussion section. I first encountered this film when we started looking at what movies to choose for this season, but also before this when I was researching the Godzilla season. And I ran into Battle in Outer Space, and though it didn't have a kaiju in it, I was still interested in definitely seeing it because it seemed very big. So I saw it and very much enjoyed it. It's very different compared to a lot of the other movies that are in this season. Even though we do have The Mysterians and War in Space, this is rather different from both of those. But it's still fun nonetheless. I really enjoyed it. I really love the huge amount of action that's in this movie. There are a lot of effects too. And so this should be a really fun talk about this film.
As for me, this was a film that I'd heard about during my period where I was basically researching Toho special effects films as much as I could, and I didn't get a chance to see it, sadly, until a little bit later. I'm not entirely off the top of my head. I can't remember what year it came out, but it was the Sony Icons of Sci-Fi DVD that came out. It was this one that also included the H-Man and Mothra, and I'd seen Mothra before, but I hadn't seen the H-Man and I hadn't seen Battle in Outer Space. And I'd been wanting to see both those films forever. And again, I don't remember what year that DVD came out. Maybe 2009, 10? I'm not entirely sure when it was. But that's when I first saw it. And I actually got it the first day it hit shelves. I went into Barnes & Noble and I snatched it up. Because it's always a good day when you can walk into a bookstore or a movie store and you can pick up copies of Toho special effects movies you've never seen before. And
yeah, no
of course,
kidding.
Mothra, yeah, it's a rarity, and you got to take those things and run. And I've been messed up before by not getting those DVDs on day one because half of the time they go out of print like immediately. So if you don't get it, you're up a creek. And you've got to go to eBay and pay an exorbitant amount of money. But thankfully, if there's anybody out there who actually hasn't seen Battle in Outer Space yet, A, I recommend it highly, and B, that DVD is very, very cheap still. And I'd actually recommend it over the Blu-ray that just got released because it has the original Japanese dialogue that the Blu-ray does not have. It's a great presentation. It was very well restored, from what I understand. And I put it in and watched it, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect. Again, like a lot of fans, when it comes to Toho special effects, the first thing you think is kaiju. And this is one of the rare examples of a science fiction film from what I like to call kind of the experimental period between the Godzilla films that were produced in 1955, Godzilla Raids Again, in 1962, or really 1961 with Mothra, which is when they were experimenting with the formula, and you get films like Half Human and Varan and The Mysterians. And Battle in Outer Space is one of the only one of these films from this period that didn't have a kaiju in it or even just shoehorned in. But
yeah, usually Tanaka was the one that was behind that.
Absolutely right. He would say, "Yes, we need to put a monster in this." But somehow a monster did not end up in Battle in Outer Space, and it is not the worse for it. It stands on its own as a really uniquely fascinating science fiction epic, dare I say, space opera in its own regards. It didn't need a monster to make it better. I fell in love with it immediately. I watched the Japanese cut first, and sadly the DVD is cursed with the deadly dub titles.
Yes,
but you can it's still you can still watch it and understand what's going on fairly well. You can still progress through the story. You can still get a sense for the characters. But really, this is a visual treat, this film, and I watch it because I like it looks gorgeous. Ifukube's score is
fantastic.
It's so fantastic. One of the top scores of his career. It is a masterpiece of film scoring. Everything, the production of this thing is it's mind blowing, and it's got a fun story. It progresses well, and again, we'll probably talk about this later. The characters may not be very well defined, but it's a film that lives or dies on its visuals, and it certainly lives.
It delivers.
It thrives.
Yes,
it delivers on the visuals. So I'm a huge proponent for Battle in Outer Space. I love this film, and I cannot wait to talk about it.
Getting to the score, Godzilla vs. Gigan used some of this music.
Yes.
Quite a bit of it, actually.
Sure did.
And if you're going to use anybody's music, use Ikufube's from this movie, because this music seems about 10 years ahead of its time.
I totally agree with that.
Electronic stuff. I mean, Forbidden Planet also did this, so I'm not going to leave that out, because that was the first one to do an electronic sort of soundtrack for a sci-fi film like this.
Tonalities.
Yes, but this is definitely good too, though, and maybe it's imitating Forbidden Planet in some aspect, but of course it's Ikufube, so you're always going to get that translation into his style, but. There is the electronic aspect of it, and the beginning music is unforgettable. You just obviously I've been watching Gigan since I was a little kid, but I'm a little biased. But the music, of course, really fits that movie well too. But it fits this movie just to a T.
It really well said too. It does. It like from the minute the dun 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 appears over the Toho logo, it's like you don't blink for the next hour and a half. And you don't stop paying attention. The music, Ifukube's music is, and this has been talked about many times before, is so integral to the way that those films work. And to the point where in some of those films, you almost feel like the music is its own character in a way. And this film, as I mentioned before, didn't have, very, very three-dimensional human characters to it. So it needed to live or die on what you saw and what you heard. And the music in this is an absolute masterwork. It's, it's his 50s work in general is really, really fantastic. And again, it's little wonder that it was reused in Gigan. They made a good choice picking that score to cull stock music from, because it fit Gigan well too.
Yeah, it did. Well, there's an alien invasion in that too, so that helps too. Yeah.
Exactly. It almost feels like it's right at home, and this is very. There's a lot of very. It feels like it was written for a space movie. It was, so it fit in Gigan really, really well. Just good stuff. And I remember when I first saw it, I was not aware at what point that music was going to show up, and of course, the first thing you hear when you start the movie is that dramatic opening piece. That's so memorable.
Sort of thing,
the space opera, that's so memorable in Gigan. You listen to it as the credits roll, the opening credits in Battle in Outer Space roll, and you just think, man, I want to watch Gigan after this. No, you never need an excuse to put in Godzilla vs. Gigan. That's good for any time, but it definitely made me feel nostalgic.
I put it out a lot.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So this is another thing about kaiju films. There are a lot of them that, whether in the Godzilla series or otherwise, there are a lot of ones where the events take place in the near future. It's very common. It was done in the Heisei period as well. It's a very common, but this is 6 years after the present in 1965.
Yes.
But we start right off and we get the initial attack, what we would think of as the ISS now.
Basically,
what we'd be doing, only that's a lot bigger deal.
Of course.
It's funny with the 50s and the 60s. If you go 5 years in the future, you're in Jetsons land. and now it's like, oh, wow, we're a lot slower than that.
Yeah, I mean, it was the late 50s, anything seemed possible. This stuff seemed like it was very easily 5 years away, if not closer, in the late 50s. And that was a sentiment that was felt all around the world. And Japan really took that ball and ran with it because of their, like, the way that the allowment for kind of a more of a, not fantasy-esque, but fantastical musings about the future. They felt like they could go there, I think, a little bit more. And of course, their wonderful, imaginative 1950s and 60s space films and space exploration films, alien invasion films from America during that period. You mentioned Forbidden Planet. It will come up again later in this episode, but George Pal's Destination Moon, things like that. And Destination Moon was it was supposed to be, if we're going to go into space, this is probably what it's going to be like. And that's kind of the attitude they were going with Battle in Outer Space as well, was trying to make it seem plausible and realistic. But at the same time, there's that fantastical, and not fantasy, but fantastical futurist streak going on in this film that you don't really get with a lot of contemporary English films.
Yes.
That dealt with the same that same kind of genre. And that's one of the things that's really appealing, because it's a genre that you recognize and it feels familiar, but once you get inside, it's its own unique thing. Just like Kaijuvision is its own unique monster movie brand. It's the uniquely Japanese stamp that they put on it. And that's one of the reasons this film is fascinating to watch and pick apart.
So the first scene we get is the train. It's a really great start, and the aliens are really jerks doing this with the bridge. Seems petty and cruel, but levitating things and the special effects, too, is something we see a lot in Dogora in 5 years.
Yeah,
which you see a lot of
that's a good point.
But we get the great media scene at the start, too. This movie's really good with that. And we get the American reporter, who is especially nice to see, kind of unexpected. And we have this nice painting of the American ship destroyed in the Panama Canal. And then, like in the Mysterians, there are all these strange things going on. And the reporter from Italy is uber rare and special. Who would have thought that Venice would ever get mentioned in a tokusatsu movie? and a water spout kind of makes sense in a place like that, though. That's probably one reason why they picked it. But it's just great. It really immerses you in this futuristic world, international news everywhere. Immediately we're on top of things when they happen.
Yeah, it pretty much starts things off with a bang. We get the exploding station, we get the bridge, and then the world just like explodes into this thing's going on, and the multinationalism that you see there. And again, this has been talked about many times before. Very Ishiro Honda, and it just gets more and more multinational as it goes along. But it's a nice little taste of what we're going to get later with the multinational approach to going up to the moon, and the people building the rocket ships at the end. But seeing the news report is really, really cool, because I always like that a lot in films, because it seems like a lot of science fiction films from the period have that moment where you have like maybe 4 or 5 different languages worth of people talking about it. The Day the Earth Stood Still started out with the same that same moment where you had all these different nationalities speaking. And I remember as a kid when I watched that film, and it did go to Tokyo, or at least somewhere in Japan at some point, with the family watching the news, and I was hearing it in Japanese. And it always kind of reminded me, like, oh, I should watch a Godzilla movie after this. Yeah. And it's interesting to think that it kind of works in reverse now, because now I want to go watch The Earth Stood Still. Yeah.
I also think about Rodan and also Destroy All Monsters. Those are 2 big, huge examples of when they did that again.
Exactly.
This mural of the space station, or the Space Research Center, that is tight. That's
it's
amazing.
Gorgeous.
And there are even the little vehicles animated.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And it establishes this futuristic place where all these nations of the world gather together for this important stuff. And it's really beautiful, though. They really the art in this is quite fantastic. And we're at the height of Japanese cinema like this, and it shows.
It's grand. It's just grand. And the live action stuff, not the interiors, but the exteriors with that great kind of cool, the building, the Space Center building with all the flag poles. And that was a real place that was actually built for the Olympics.
Yes.
It was built in 59 leading up to the Olympics.
Is mentioned in episode 9 for Mothra vs.
Yeah.
Godzilla. And here at Kaijuvision, we have gone on the Olympics quite a bit, actually. And I'm very much anticipating the exciting 2020 Olympics, and I'll have stuff about that on the show as well. But yes, this was a nice futuristic looking building that was built specifically as I believe a stadium, right?
Yes. Yeah, and it was brand new, so that it wasn't damaged or anything. It didn't have any wear and tear on it. It looked like a building of the future. That's why they picked it. I mean, it was available. It looks great on screen. I mean, when I first read that, I thought, man, it could have been a space station. Just from that one angle you see of it, it could very easily, it felt like it could be for something very, very futuristic. And of course for the Olympics, and it was 5 years away at that point. But you got to start early on these things, and luckily for them, it was ready for them to use at that point. But when you take that and you combine the stuff that was in the like the interiors of the space building, and then the beautiful matte painting that shows the outside, the illusion is stunning.
Yes.
That you're in this futuristic space where mankind has come together to take on any potential threat that might come about, or just to explore space, just to do something scientifically new.
The aspect of the frostbite, this method that they use to freeze objects to absolute zero so that the atoms don't move and then they lose gravity. Because they lose gravity and then they're subject to the Earth's rotation. But it's quite interesting. There's apparently an article in a Journal of Science in 1959 that stated that at absolute zero, an object's gravitational pull is eliminated. So
that's absolutely true.
With this movie, they're pulling back on the fantasy and they're pushing more towards the science fiction direction.
Exactly.
And they're actually they're not
from a modern
really pulling things out of nowhere. They're actually diligent on the science.
They're thinking about it. Yeah. And from a modern perspective, looking at that now, it sounds like the classic, science mumbo jumbo. They're like, oh, things are floating and here's the answer. But no, it was a concurrently written article on the topic. And during this period, a lot of the creators at Toho were pulling things out of headlines. I mean, the one of the more famous examples is Rodan and the jet exploding, which was pulled from a supposed UFO encounter that took place in America. And Tanaka saw the headline and he said, well, I'm going to stick it in the movie. And so those things definitely happened. And again, I remember trying to find that. I read about it because when I first saw the movie, I was like,
yeah,
that explains that. Now we're gonna move on, and then I discovered that it was something being experimented with. He Flying Saucer Man.
Yeah, he showed up and it's like, yes, that's completely. She slipped into another dimension when she jumped out of the plane, and you're done.
What's really funny is if you watch that scene, there's a Natal UFO prop on his desk from this movie.
Yes.
That's interesting connection. Absolute Zero tech comes back multiple times in future films. With the Atragon and Kiryu many, many years later.
Yes,
but it's the first time it's mentioned. Yeah. That's right. But it's the first time it's mentioned. And it seems so kind of crazy, but it was something being discussed at the time. And it really shows you how much homework they did going into this film. And
it's so appropriate, too. The thing that I most am amazed with was in Rodan when they actually mentioned global warming, like in 1956.
Yeah.
They really had that right. But anyway, we see George Conway again, and he's from Gorath and from the Mysterians, but he's playing a different character. And he's always welcome to see. We see him a number of times. Then our two biggest characters are probably Major Katsumiya as well as Dr. Adachi. And these are
Yes.
two really hugely important characters in the story. And once you describe the first 5 characters or so in this movie, you really start running on empty. Because it isn't that kind of a movie. We aren't fleshing out all these characters because it's more about the action and it's more about the events and the scenario that takes place. But
That's well said.
But I do like that. I do like these 2 characters particularly a lot. I mean, we'll get to Tsuchiya in a moment. But I mean,
he's his own topic.
2 characters, but these 2 characters are interesting, and Dr. Adachi is kind of a good stand-in for who I would guess would be sort of Takashi Shimura. But as we mentioned in the last episode, everybody else when they were filming Battle in Outer Space, probably everybody else was filming The Three Treasures. So that's why we have it's like this movie is pretty much everybody who didn't do Three Treasures.
Yeah, and it's interesting because again, Koreya Senda, who's basically taking over. His character is the same doctor. He's Dr. Adachi. He's playing Takashi Shimura's character from Mysterians.
Right.
It's the same character, and same with Harold Conway. He's the only one who came back as himself, and of course the connections between the Mysterians and Battle in Outer Space are tenuous at best, because plans to make it a super duper direct sequel didn't make it into the final script phase. But he's interesting, and I definitely like Koreya Senda. He's a great actor. Yeah. He's really, really cool. He's got the same kind. He doesn't have. I mean, who else could be Takashi Shimura except Takashi Shimura? But he has a similar kind of a feel to him, where he walks on screen and you're like, okay, this guy's a scientist, and so he's great in the role. And here's a fun fact that I recently discovered. Apparently, in real life, he was Jerry Ito's uncle, Jerry Ito from Mothra. He was Clark Nelson. Yeah.
The American-born Jerry Ito. Yeah.
Yeah, he was. They were related because Koreya Senda was not his real name. It was a pseudonym that he acted under. But he's great in the film. Of course, Ryo Ikebe. And Ryo Ikebe is an interesting case because in this film, he's very bland. Yeah. His character is very bland. So you kind of get the feeling that that's just kind of how he is. But if you watch a lot of his other films, non-genre pictures, specifically Ishiro Honda's Farewell Rabal, and other films from that period. I mean, he's an incredible actor, and he actually had to prove himself because he was originally, he was about 40 when they shot this film or so, but he was still good looking, and when he was younger, he was like the heartthrob, in Japanese film, and a lot of critics were like, well, that's all he can do. He can be a heartthrob. So he basically had to prove himself, and he did, and he became a very highly respected dramatic actor, and he didn't do a lot of genre stuff. After this, Gorath, he was in Gorath, and then of course he was in War in Space many, many years later, almost a solid 2 decades after this film was made. But this film does not really display the full breadth of his acting ability. And again, it doesn't hurt the film. This is a film where the thinness of the characters, to me, doesn't hurt it. Because to me, it's not about the characters. They get you where you need to go. And there's enough there for you to sympathize with them enough. But again, it's the visuals.
It's similar to Destroy All Monsters.
It's very similar to Destroy All Monsters, actually.
It's about the events. It's not about the characters as much. Yeah. And we don't need every movie to be a character study, for goodness sake. But
no, I don't think so.
There's a time for it and there's not.
It's very documentary-like, which, again, very Honda-esque. But there are a lot of moments that feel like a documentary in this, where the camera just kind of sits there and films the scientists doing things. The documentary feel helps the film a lot to not be so character oriented, because it at the end of the day, again, at least to me, it didn't need to be.
It's a history of something.
Character oriented. Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So Dr. Ahmed, he gets hypnotized, mind controlled in this meeting, and this is the first time we've run into mind control in tokusatsu, which this reappears particularly in Destroy All Monsters. It's messed around with a lot in the Heisei period. There's mind control is a thing, and sometimes it's the monsters that are being mind controlled. But this is really the first time that happens. Then there's this wonderful little tense moment, and Etsuko, she gets the daylights just scared out of her, seeing him disappear in this red light.
Yes.
She's scared to death, and she does a pretty good job with that. And once you figure out that invaders have teleportation technology, you realized you might very well be screwed. Because
this is very true.
Teleportation technology is very powerful, and once you realize you're up against somebody that has that, it's like, oh no, we're really out of our league, aren't we?
Yeah, we're in trouble here.
And Iwamura appears, who is played by Yoshio Tsuchiya, which I can see why he didn't do Three Treasures. Of course he would be doing this because of his personality and what he loved doing. And he gets to be the guy who gets to be mind controlled by the aliens at that.
Yeah, he was finally starting to live his dream. He's a fantastic actor. And it was around this period that he was starting to finally get out from underneath the thumb of Akira Kurosawa, who'd taken him under his wing and had basically forbidden him from doing a lot of the more unusual roles that he so wanted to do. He wanted to be in Godzilla, even if it was just the original one, even if it was just a minor role. And Kurosawa was like, no, Seven Samurai, bro. Finally, Tsuchiya got he was in Godzilla Raids again, but it was he was a pilot in a plane. You know, it wasn't a very unusual exotic role, which is what he wanted to do. And of course, the Mysterians was where he finally said, I don't care if I'm in the helmet, I want to be in the movie as the weird alien guy. And they were like, sure, you can be the leader of the aliens. They won't see your face. Is that okay? That's totally fine. And in this one, he gets to take the strangeness up a notch. And it's saying something when playing an alien in a cape and a helmet where you can't see your face isn't your strangest role.
Yeah.
He's nuts in this film, but he's not hammy. He acts, but he doesn't overact. He's quite perfect. Is
the earnestness that I love about so many of these movies, that the acting is done with so much earnestness, and then there's so much fantastical stuff going on, and yet they're still so earnest. It was one thing I love about the acting in all these movies, but Tsuchiya really nails it, and his expressions are dead on, and it's just enough. He hits the tone just perfectly. I really love it. This is one of my favorite Yoshio Tsuchiya roles that he's ever had.
Oh, mine too.
Yeah, there is Control of Planet X, but
yeah,
everybody. In this, we get to see his face a lot more, and we get to see him really act. And I feel like the movie really benefited from that.
I agree. It's like saying who's your favorite kaiju, and you can't say Godzilla. What's your favorite Tsuchiya role, and it can't be the controller. It's similar to that. I mean, his performance as the controller is immortal. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, same, and I'd say the same for Shindo from King Ghidorah in '91. I love that role.
One of the best parts of the whole Heisei series.
Oh, absolutely. It's so good. But he's great in Battle in Outer Space because he was an oddball in real life, and he was the best kind of oddball. He committed to these roles. He believed in these roles. It wasn't just a job, and it wasn't just like, okay, now you're an alien in a B movie. No, like these weren't B movies, and far from it. And he took such care in crafting like how he would do these things. And again, he's probably the most fleshed out character in the film, and he's not even that fleshed out when you compare it to something from a similar period. I mean, even like Three Treasures came out the same year. The characters in that are far more fleshed out than Battle in Outer Space. The Mysterians was somewhat light on character in some places, but even it had more characterization than Battle in Outer Space does. But it doesn't hurt the film. And Tsuchiya being kind of the human, our way of getting into the story, because he's experiencing the story from both sides. He's at once alien and he's at once human. And it's really our only peek at the aliens, too. I mean, we don't really know their motivations that much. And our only
just like
real
destroy
peek
all
into
monsters. We're not here to think about why are they doing this. It's not that kind of a thing.
No, it's like, no, we gotta get right to the action.
Yeah,
and that's what this one is too. And Tsuchiya is a great bridge between us and the human characters and us and the aliens. And it's really the only one we get on the alien side for sure. In addition to just the talent that he had, the raw talent that he had as an actor, he's just fun to watch.
Yes.
He's just fun to watch him do these performances because he was so into it. He was so committed to it. And that, to me, is one of the most magical things about watching Tsuchiya-san act. And I miss that man. I really miss that man. Mm-hmm. He was a joy. I wish I'd gotten to meet him. I've been lucky enough through conventions to meet many of the Golden Age actors and actresses, and I value all of those meetings a lot. And I dearly wish that Tsuchiya-san had been among them, because he's a hero. To me, I know I love the way he approached things, and I really I wish I'd gotten to tell him that. You know what I mean? I wish I'd gotten to share that.
He seemed to be very forward-looking.
Very much so. Yes.
Yeah, very much into the future, and he believed that there would be alien contact at some point.
Yeah, he
believed
reported
it. He believed it was imminent, and I believe, probably looking forward to it.
I think so too. He claimed to have witnessed UFOs on several occasions early on in his life, and he was a member of at least one very forward-thinking scientific society, and it was his idea in the Mysterians that he'd read an article about the land being sold on Mars at random, so that line in the Mysterians came from him throwing it in there. And that's a more famous story, but he was definitely forward-thinking. He was definitely thinking about humanity's future. I think that he felt he was taking a part in helping to form our vision of what that future could be through his roles. And I think he succeeded, because, I mean, even though we don't have space stations or moon bases, or, we're not mind-controlling monsters left and right, we still want to see that future. It's amazing to think that this film next year will be 60 years old, and when it was made, Tsuchiya-san and the people involved with it were fully in the belief that we would have, by 1965, we'd have a space station. And
a moon landing and all of this.
And moon landing. I mean, and we have a space station now, but it's not nearly the science fiction version. We've landed people on the moon.
It's not quite 2001: A Space Odyssey.
It's not quite. Yeah, it's not quite 2001. It's not quite that science fiction-y. But we've done amazing things. But we're not colonizing the moon. We're not colonizing Mars. We still look to films, even older films, for that promise of a future. So it's crazy to think that all these decades later, these films that are saying, yes, this is possible, are still kind of saying, yes, this is possible. I think Tsuchiya would be happy that there are many people that still watch these films and have that feeling of, yeah, let's make a rocket that can was it a couple of years ago, they finally experimented with a rocket that could lift off like a classic style rocket, and then it lands on its back fins.
See how
like
many
in
movies
this
were
movie.
Vindicated when that happened?
So many movies.
Like
I felt
Astro
vindicated
Monster,
when that
just
happened.
obvious one.
Yeah. Astro
a
Monster.
whole bunch
and
of these. They were finally vindicated. It's like, yes, they are landing right side up. And
I was so happy. And the first movie I thought of was Battle in Outer Space. I actually thought of that before I thought of Astro Monster. I went, man, landing on the moon, they're going backwards like that. And like that kind of stuff, I think he'd be happy to see. And I think a lot of the people that worked on these films would be happy to see these things happen, but also excited at the fact that we still haven't accomplished these things, and there are people that want to out there.
Especially in the 50s, it was about imagine the possibilities. So many different movies have come out of that premise.
Yes, and the idea of the potentiality of humanity's future, especially, the scientific potentiality has, that period, especially in the late 50s and early 60s, produced some unbelievable movies that were just so full of that hope. Hope is a big word when it comes to this stuff, and just like we can do this, and if we can't, we need to work to get it, and then we can do it, because there's nothing we can't do.
Yeah, like you said, like we can do this. We can create a plutonium-powered heat ray gun that we can defend Earth with and destroy aliens if necessary. Like all of these things are possible in the future, as well as the SPIPs. I guess that would be the spaceships.
Yeah.
And there are so many grown-up sci-fi toys in this movie that all these scientists are loving. And there's something important to notice here about how there's a bit more science involved in this, obviously. And because Mysterians, the Markolite fops, that's pretty fantastical.
Yeah.
But then this movie is a bit more realistic than that. And then this has more plausible technology, especially the fighter jets. These space planes, they look so futuristic yet functional. And those fighters are based on the X-15, the fighter that was released by the U.S. in 1959. And these fighters were special because they were the world's first space plane. They could go over 50 miles above ground. And so
That's
technically
amazing.
the pilots of these planes were considered astronauts. But
Yeah,
this is a
absolutely.
yeah. So it's a hypersonic, faster than sound, rocket-powered experimental aircraft. So quite amazing, and that's what a lot of what these fighter jets were developed off of. But it's really wonderful technology, and the X-15 is just an incredible example of the power of what is possible in the future to create. And
Exactly.
you're looking at the future when you look at that. Dr. Ahmed appears again, and he's engaging in all this espionage and violence on behalf of the aliens, because it's a big thing with the aliens that they want to get rid of this nuclear-powered heat ray gun, because they want to get rid of that and any other technology that might rival theirs.
Yeah.
But he really fools them, and he takes advantage of their sort of docile behavior. And he takes Etsuko hostage, and then he announces that he's from Natal, and just like the aliens are, and he's a voice for them. He's just an object. But of course, then they drop an object on him, and knocks the gun away, and hurts his hand and his arm, but yet he triumphantly leaves, even though he failed in his mission, and disappears. And he is discovered that he was being controlled by this radio apparatus that was implanted in the brain, which that made me think again of Destroy All Monsters.
Very Destroy All Monsters.
And so they have a base on the moon, and then this is just like in the Mysterians, kind of where they had the base that's on the dark side of the moon. That's where they're operating out of, and they're using that premise again. I could talk more about how this was meant to be a sequel and how all of that connects with War in Space later on, but I really feel satisfied just saying that. I mean, they're talking about this as a pseudo trilogy or whatever. I don't know what that means, but these are so disconnected that I really don't want to call them a trilogy, just because there were so many changes that were made in between them. But one thing that's fun here is, though, that the UN works faster and more effective and more united in this movie than the UN has ever been.
This is very true.
Maybe that's the most fantastical aspect of the whole movie is that.
It's
that's
just
the most
oozing
unbelievable
optimism.
thing in this movie. But
It might be.
they decide to land in a low-lying area of the Sea of Rains, or the Mare Imbrium, and that is actually where Apollo 15 landed in 1971. So
That's right, yeah.
So that it was an impact from an asteroid meteor, and it's crashed into the moon, and that created a lot of the topography of the moon. But that's one of those places that they landed in when they did the Apollo project. Tsuburaya, he told Toho that he thought a moon landing would be taking place soon, like eventually, but it's destined to happen. And so they should do something in the movie about this. And the events in the film take place in 1965, and then the actual moon landing would appear and happen in 1969. So he was only 4 years off. It was actually pretty good.
Yeah. It's pretty good guess that the amount of scientific, I guess, prediction that happens in this film that ended up being pretty close to true. Some of the things, like the way gravity is handled, were obviously that's not how it works. Yeah. But the way that they handled a lot of it was shockingly accurate. I mean, in terms of just creating the imagery, it was 10 years before the moon landing. When the story takes place, like you said, it's only 4 years. That's a pretty good mark to hit. And 59 was a good year to be able to do this, because 1959 was the year that the first pictures of the dark side of the moon were taken. Mm-hmm. And Tsuburaya realized, well, soon we're going to know what the moon looks like, and we're going to lose an element of the mystery. And so that's one of the reasons that this film ended up getting made, and made the way it was. Yeah. Because Tsuburaya said, like, eventually we're going to know, but we want to have this opportunity to do this and try to make it as realistic as possible before they point at us and say, haha, you know, the moon doesn't look like that, or this and that isn't right. Even though the moon's topography, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the effects, it's not entirely what the moon looks like. it was closer than a lot of movies during the period, depicted the moon. So I remember the effects staff in the late 60s, the mid to late 60s, when more photographs of the moon finally came out, when they saw these pictures, I read somewhere once that they were they felt very vindicated. We were right.
Overall,
we got
I'd be
close.
pleased with that aspect of it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'd be like, yeah, we did a pretty good job. We got pretty close.
Yeah.
The scene where we have Iwamura and he's in his car and he gets taken over by the aliens. It's just fantastic.
Yeah.
He does such a good job doing with his expressions, like we said. And did you notice the steering wheel of his car is on the left?
I did notice that.
Yeah.
I did notice that. I thought that was very unusual. I don't remember which viewing I caught that the first time, but the reason I noticed it is because when he takes his hand off, it continues to kind of drive itself. Mm-hmm. And like the steering wheel just kind of jiggles from side to side, even though he's not touching it. And I was thinking to myself, wait a minute, this is Japan. What's happening here? Something's not right.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know quite what was going on with that scene. I mean, I don't know if it's, I don't know. It's interesting.
I know. I sort of wonder if like they thought that in the future standards and practices would be so homogenized across the earth that everybody be driving on the right side, everybody be using the metric system. Crazy ideas like that.
Crazy stuff
that they had back then. But I couldn't help but notice that. I was like, wait a minute, shouldn't that be on the other side? Anyway,
I wouldn't put it past them to have snuck in something like that. I mean, this movie was written.
Not everybody would have noticed
Sekizawa,
it, but
so
I think Japanese people would have noticed it though.
I think that would have, like, we're so used to it that it did take me a while to notice it. I don't remember when I saw it the first time, but then I thought, man, something's off about this. But in 1959, I'm sure Japanese viewers were probably thinking to themselves, "Why is what?
Yeah.
Like that's not right." It's a good observation.
Yeah, they'd notice that. I love the scene where the astronauts are essentially having their rock star moment. They get the military send-off, huge military send-off, and a ticker tape parade. And I love that. Really true, actually, and it was back then. I mean, astronauts are still rock stars in a lot of ways, but they definitely were during the Apollo program, to be sure. The American astronauts back in the golden age, in the 50s, 60s, they actually had a book, and it had the addresses of women. And they could essentially call any of these women anytime, and it would happen. Like that. That is how these guys were literal, like, how popular they were. Like, it was quite amazing.
That's crazy.
Yeah. The astronauts were mostly American and Japanese on the expedition that's in the movie. And and the movie came out one year, and we talked about this a lot in the episode on Mothra, which is the signing of the security treaty, which that happened for 1960. So this was right before that. And so this movie did have a little bit of consciousness about the fact that the security treaty was going to be in effect in the future. And so it's in the movie, reflects, it isn't mentioned, but it's kind of, you can tell. I couldn't help but notice regarding, it's not an effect, but the tower that the astronauts take up the ship, and you see it as during the launch scene of these two rockets. That tower is incredibly detailed.
It's amazing.
So many pieces to that. It is,
and it's so beautiful.
I was almost shocked seeing that. It was like, talk about attention to detail. It's very nice.
This movie is full of little moments like that where you look at a prop or a miniature and you think, my God, look at the detail on this thing. And I think the gantry, the big gantry comes out of it, and the tower and the elevator inside. It's just mind blowing. And I think what really sells it is how slow it moves away from the speep.
Yes.
And the scale, like, this movie has like an incredible sense of scale to it in all of its big special effects moments, but scale works with it works better when what you're looking at is so detailed that you totally believe that it's there, that it's real, and that it's that detailed.
And you have to move it slow enough, because if not, then it looks like a little toy. You have to act like it's something that's big, so you have to move it like something that's big. And they really got that down perfectly.
They really did. They moved it so slow, and it looks like it's going about the right speed that you'd expect something that size to go while you're watching the movie. On set, it probably moved so painfully slow. Unless it's possible that they shot it at a higher frame rate like they did with the kaiju to
and
make it
slowed it down,
like not slow-mo, but just to give it a bigger sense of scale by cranking the camera a little bit differently. It's possible they did that. I couldn't really tell, but whatever they did, it looks gigantic, and the detail on it sells the illusion 200%. It's amazing.
Then we get our wonderful little gravity scene in this spaceship, and we have this actor, and he was in Gorath as well. When he's having all these, he has two little mishaps. Once after they get out of the ship, and then once on the ship after it's taken off. So they're like, yeah, gravity's different. You have to remember that. And he's like, oh yeah. I mean, that's really Sekizawan.
That was a nice. It's one of the moments in this film that did feel like him, because the rest of it doesn't really necessarily, and this is very early on in his screenwriting career. I mean, at this point at Toho, in terms of his visual effects stuff, he'd done Varan, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And there's like Varan, you watch it, you can see the Sekizawa touches in the characters. You can see them. They're not nearly as developed as they would be just 3 years later in Mothra, for crying out loud. I mean, 3 years. Mm-hmm. And like it's crazy to see the differences. And in Battle in Outer Space, the characters are very, very thin, but that moment, like the two moments where he stands up and boop, he's up on the ceiling and they have to pull him down and they're all laughing about it, and then he jumps over the car on the moon. That's Sekizawa. You can feel his handprint on this film, and it's a lot more subtle than I think most other films that he wrote.
It's no King Kong versus Godzilla.
No, it's no King Kong versus Godzilla. Definitely not. But it's definitely like that moment of levity is needed, because this film is actually very, very serious. Yeah. And again, it's like as originally conceived, it was supposed to be basically a war movie. Mm-hmm. It was written as a straight war movie. It's not really hard pressed to watch it and think, yeah, I'm watching a war movie now. But it was, it needed its moments of levity. Playing with gravity is definitely a fun way to have levity. Playing with gravity and making it funny in a more tense moment or in a more tense movie pops up in a lot of science fiction films from this period. Even on science fiction television. I mean, there's the pilot of Lost in Space has a great moment where they have to turn the gravity off and they're all floating around. And that was 1965. That was a few years later. But it was definitely something that happens, because you know what? Darn it, people floating around, it's funny.
Moonraker.
Moonraker. One word, Moonraker.
Yep. Nothing more needs to be said.
Nothing more needs to be said.
So after they've launched, they come across the pieces of this space station JSS-3 that they were left along with a body floating in space, and they watch it sort of float past them.
The striking moment of that, and Ifukube's music in this scene really drives home the drama, because it's a false flag. Yeah. Because the music is dramatic, and you think something's coming, and they all get ready, battle stations, and what is it? It's debris from a corpse floating in there, and the music suddenly dies down and turns into this very sad, recalling Godzilla on the ocean floor piece from the end of the original Godzilla a little bit, and the da-da-da moment, where it kind of gets very, very mournful. And at that moment, it is a war film.
Yeah.
And in that moment it's a very striking moment. And every time it never fails to actually deeply affect me every time I see it. It's coming, and then you see this little body out there, and they're very, reverent, and they bow their heads and say a prayer. Every single time I see it, it's affecting. And then it's followed up with that shot of the Earth getting farther away, and you think, oh God, this is not going to be easy. Yeah. They're leaving. They're not even on Earth anymore. They're in enemy territory now, and there's might not be anything they can do.
Yeah, a lot of vulnerability.
You never know.
And
very, very vulnerable moment.
Yeah, and our astronauts have a prayer sort of for their deceased comrade. Honda's well-known anti-war sentiments are influencing this scene big time.
Very much so.
Honda's experience in the Imperial Army, and that made him reflect upon the sadness of war. There's definitely that going on. This is a Honda film after all. And
yes,
mind-controlled Iwamura, he goes down to the engineering room and he's told to destroy the heat ray gun because that's a big deal. And then because that's viewed as one of the biggest threats by the aliens. Yeah. His expressions are probably the best when he's doing that part of the movie. And not everyone can do that kind of a job. If you didn't know what expressions to display, then this would be really hard to do. And it's like he can't fight it, but he wants to. And then as soon as it's cut off, he's able to go back to normal. But I still get a kick of Tsuchiya hitting the guy over the head with the wrench, and his helmet's on, and he's instantly knocked out. It feels like it's a very 1940s thing to do.
Yeah,
and I feel like
do
you think that was funny on purpose?
Creep. What was that now?
Do you think this was funny on purpose? Him doing that?
That's a good question. It's very possible
because they didn't want to make it violent. This is very
it's possible that it was. I'm not sure if they were going for funny, but there hadn't been one of those moments of levity in the film at that point for a few minutes. It had been a while since there was something. It's possible it might have been for laughs, but every time I see the scene, I just start getting a headache because it looks funny. It's just like bonk, and you hear that sound. But then I think, it's all fun and games until you actually get hit in the head with a wrench.
And it reminds me of Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, when that happens.
Actually,
hit over the head with the wrench, and he expresses this real amount of pain.
Yeah,
when he does it, but it's kind of funny when that happens. But there's a lot of stuff to talk about in this movie regarding the vehicles.
Oh, very much so.
Especially, I would say Car 1 and Car 2, and then the Spips, things. Definitely. Car 1 and Car 2, that is pretty amazing. The air cushion feature, on those, that is really pretty cool. I like it.
It's really, really fascinating. It's fascinating to watch them move across the Martian landscape because they're so unusually shaped and colored for the terrain. They pop out, and the vehicles in this film and a lot of the tech came from the mind of a guy named Shigeru Kamatsuzaki, who was he was an engineer, and he knew how to make these things look fantastical, but also give them a functionality where you could look at them and you didn't just see something pretty. And he designed all kinds of fantastical equipment and vehicles and weapons for the Toho films during the Golden Age. Probably his most famous creation is Atragon, is the Gotengo, which came about 4 years after this film came out. His stamp is all over this film. Kamatsuzaki was responsible for making the Speeps look like you're kind of a general kind of rockety shape, but also make them unique. And the all the buttons and knobs on the insides came from him. The UFOs came from him. But my favorite is definitely the cars, because they're so interesting looking. And the first time I saw it, my first thought was, oh, it's cute. Look at that cute little car. They've got little noses, they're adorable, but they also they look functional. They don't look like goofy, at least not to me. They don't look like goofy, B budget vehicles.
No,
and
it's
the
not
weight
just
that
something
they had.
silly looking.
They
look like transports, like they're actual.
They do.
There's a lot of functionality, and there's between the Speeps and the cars and all the other technology, there's continuity, like stylistic continuity, that all of this stuff is part of the same universe. It isn't just this weird thing over here and then another weird thing that looks totally different and just throwing stuff at us haphazardly. There was a lot of thought put into this, and especially the ships too, the actual space planes that are towards the end of the movie. All of it goes together.
It all feels like it fits, and that's sometimes you don't even think of that when you're watching the film. But when you think about it later, you're like, man, it really all feels like you kind of forget how important that is to have a sense of design continuity between, Spaceship One and Spaceship Two, and then the cars, and then this and that. It literally does all look like it came out of like the same plant, during the same era. It's really effective. I mean, even their spacesuits look like the spacesuits match the ships.
Yeah.
Their weapons match the ships, and it all comes together to form a really uniquely science fiction visual spectacle. I mean, God knows how many spaceship movies came out in the 1950s, and most of them were in black and white, and then even the color ones, not all of them are as visually distinctive or interesting, I think, as Battle in Outer Space. And there are a lot, like Forbidden Planet is an exception to that, of course, because Forbidden Planet is just gorgeous.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's just gorgeous to look at. But there's, like Battle in Outer Space does that kind of similar thing where it's colorful without being fantastic, and it's exotic without being unrealistic. And that's a fine line to walk, especially when you're in charge of designing, maybe 5 or 6 different kinds of vehicles or weapons for one film. You want it to look like it'll work, but you also want it to look interesting. And it's amazing. We're talking a film that's, again, almost 60 years old here. It's just amazing how much creative energy was put into just the car. Just designing the cars. And the air cushion, like you mentioned before, is a great feature. And they actually did that by spraying water vapor out of the bottoms of the props.
Yes, I guess
which
that
I thought
too.
was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute, how did they? Oh, okay, yeah. There's a little spray thing on the bottom.
Yeah,
that's nice. I mean, that's simple, but it looks exactly the way you think it would look.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because you want it to be visual rather than just having it be invisible air that's coming out of the bottom. Because then it's kind of taking a little bit of fun out of it, I guess.
I think so.
But because you want to be able to see this stuff happening and actually show everybody. Oh, yeah. The part about the aliens coming into the cave and mobbing Etsuko.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are our aliens this time around. A little different from the Mysterians.
A little different.
Yeah, they're these little bit diminutive, and their helmets sort of make them look like they have faces that look like a rat or something.
They do. They look very
like little
rodent-like.
rat face helmets.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they're making this noise that was used for the Meganula from
Exactly,
Rodan.
yeah.
Yeah, they're using that sound effect. It's more about the invasion than it is about the aliens, I guess would be the way that I'd describe it.
This film could have gotten away with not showing the alien.
Right.
Without showing what they looked like. But again, many sci-fi films from this period fell into that kind of trap of, well, we have to show it. It Came from Outer Space from Universal had the same thing, where they filmed they filmed pretty much the entire movie, and you didn't see the alien. And then at the end, Universal's execs basically said, we have to show the alien or no one's going to come see this movie. And so they built this big old prop, and it was a creepy looking alien, but it's not nearly as creepy as what's in your own mind. So they I think monster loving kids everywhere were happy they showed the alien in that film, but they didn't need to. And this film didn't necessarily need to show the aliens, but as a lover of strange creatures and alien designs and weird spacesuits and things like that, viewers liked, you like to see that stuff.
Right.
They were originally going to be a lot more exotic. The original plan for the Natal aliens was to have them and their tech be very insect-like. They were supposed to be very, very much like bugs, humanoid bugs, and they were going to have their own cars, their own kind of all-terrain vehicles that looked like pill bugs.
Instead of the saucers, yeah.
Instead of the saucers. But ultimately, just for budget reasons, I mean, the budget on this thing was already pretty darn big, and they used it, very wisely, I think. But in the end, they decided that they were still going to show the aliens, but they simplified them into being these diminutive, space-suited beings. I think it works in a strange way. They almost remind me of the aliens when you finally see them in Earth versus the Flying Saucers, Ray Harryhausen's film.
Right.
Where most of the story is about the saucers. It's about the tech, and you're fighting against this faceless enemy. But they decided, again, we need to show the aliens. So they had these aliens in these big clunky, they almost look like the Michelin tire guy, these big suits. Who doesn't like actually seeing the alien? But it's not nearly as creepy as it would have been otherwise. And it's interesting trying to take the diminutive little squeaky aliens and then trying to combine it with the creepy voice that speaks to Iwamura in his brain. And you're kind of thinking, that little guy made that sound? So it's interesting. It's interesting. And again, it doesn't hurt the film at all, but it's interesting to think big, scary, faceless alien. And then you got these little guys just kind of squeaking, running around.
Yeah.
But I love those little aliens.
Yeah, and Katsumiya saves Etsuko from them, and then he kills them all off, like with one fell swoop.
Yeah, he just zaps them all down, and down they go.
Yeah, I don't know. Easily. I might have too if they were doing that. I don't know.
Yeah, I probably would have. Get off my girl. That's not nice.
Yeah.
In the original story as it was written, their diminutive little nature was, and this is another sci-fi trope. They become so reliant on technology that their bodies were these tiny little weak things, and that's not communicated in the final script at all. They just kind of stand around you and grab you, when they don't have their technology to back them up. So it's an interesting theme, and it's not in the final script in any way, but you can kind of extrapolate it by watching it.
This base that is on the moon is quite impressive. And
I think so.
The center of the base comes out and it rotates, and I love the overall design. And having the ships enter it and exit it as this is going on, that adds to the scale, trying to figure out the scale of how big this thing is. And it's actually pretty big, and it's similar to the one from the Mysterians on a base level. There's a center of it, and it's rotating, and there's this voice coming out of it, yelling at you. This on the moon, this moon base for this movie though it's obviously different enough.
Yeah,
but it's really cool though. The ray that comes out of it is pretty impressive. That light blue ray, the beam that comes out of it.
It's really pretty to look at.
The effects of it missing and them destroying all of the mountains on the moon, that's a nice effect too, with the cutting, and then all of the mountain, it just explodes out in all these little pieces. It looks very nice.
It does, and that was hard to do back then because, again, all those lasers were hand animated, and they had to time them with the line, the little explosive line that would cut into the hill and make sure that beam hit where it was. And if you watch the movie, there's one scene where the beam goes in one direction and then the explosion goes in the opposite direction. But it was one tiny little moment, and you got to really be looking for it. And even then, it doesn't take away from the movie at all. It's just a little special effects moment where you're like, you can feel the hands of the people doing this and the kind of the tediousness that comes with trying to make this imagery.
Yeah, and
it's fascinating.
Yeah, and the Mysterians, there was one of the part where the Markalite Fops, the ray hits the dome, and then like the other side of the dome blows up.
Yeah,
and it's like,
that was a thing.
But it's sort of like that. When we see Iwamura shooting at the UFOs when they appear, that's pretty awesome. Like he's just there with one of those guns, and he's just taking them out. And he says he's better now and that he'll stay to defend them as they escape. So he sacrifices himself for their safety to repay the debt of having destroyed one of the two rockets and all the trouble that he caused while under alien control.
Exactly.
They really nailed the mood and the atmosphere to make the audience think about that without making it this 10-minute long, drawn out scene.
I'm going to go kill myself now. Don't do it. I totally have to.
Instead of just getting extremely internalized, instead we're doing just enough to drive the point home without hitting us over the head.
Exactly. And again, this film didn't have characters that were fleshed out enough to really do a 10-minute long hit you over the head moment. But Iwamura, being the most fleshed out of them all, his death does affect the viewer in a way, and it's done really, really effectively and it works very well in tandem with the amount of characterization that was supplied to the characters before that. It's a great moment, and it's, again, Ishiro Honda isms. You've got the character who sacrifices himself, a la Serizawa. And I mean, there's not a lot of parallels to be made there, but Honda's films have a tendency to have a character sacrifice themselves for the sake of others and or the world. Namikawa in Monster Zero, I just mentioned Serizawa. Katsura in Terror of Mechagodzilla. It's a thing. It's amazing, like, and again, with the amount of characterization that is present in this film, that when you see Iwamura doing this thing, you're still like, oh no, don't die. He's cool.
Yeah.
You feel the emotion of it, and you don't want him to go, but you know that it has to happen. He takes out more of the flying saucers single-handedly than either of the teams did while piloting their cars.
Yeah.
He takes out a bunch of them. And then again, at the end, the two fly over the ridge and zap him and he disappears. And that's how that ends. His sacrifice, one of the characters on the ship says it in the next scene, is like, we can't bring him back, but now we can keep fighting. And he says it very sadly, not just because his friend is gone, but because the fighting is still going to have to continue. And that's really not worth celebrating. You know what I mean? So
right, which also makes it like a war movie.
Very much so, yeah. There's echoes of a legitimate war movie inside of this film that really feels more like a big epic sci-fi film, which it is. But I mean, the film's literally War in Space in Japan. That's the title. So it doesn't come across as a straight up war film, but in a lot of ways, that's very much the story they were telling, and echoes of that survive enough to make the moments where you think to yourself, yeah, this is a war movie. It makes them very effective, those moments. So Iwamura's death definitely is a sad, sad part.
And so then they get home, and what's the result of all of this? The world unites against an outside invasion instead of being against each other. And this is this grassroots popular sentiment everywhere that says we need to defend ourselves, we need to declare war on aggressive invaders, and then we essentially need to militarize the crap out of the space program, and then spend a lot of money and resources to build up the space military. Forget diplomacy. We're not messing around. We're building all these rocket launching sites in Siberia and northern Texas, and we're gonna get all this done now. It's very resolute, and at the same time, I think it'd be kind of scary, even though the part about the whole world uniting is great, but obviously you're up against a lot. You have to prepare for an alien invasion to occur, and you have to fight it off somehow. Yeah.
It's a big moment, and again, it is pure Honda.
Absolutely.
The man, like, this movie, like, when you look at his filmography, especially the Brotherhood of Man filmography, where he really drives that point home, it's done subtly and effectively in films like Mothra vs. Godzilla. It's done, on a bigger scale and effectively in like the Mysterians and Gorath and films like that, and other ones here and there. And then, of course, it kind of turns into the Brotherhood of Monsters when you get to Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. But this film, for my money, is the ultimate in Ishiro Honda basically proclaiming his hopes for a world united. I don't think it gets much more in your face than this film.
Right.
The giant scenes of all these people protesting in multiple languages, and at the beginning of the film, and again at the end briefly, the decisions being made in a giant UN style meeting place. We're peeking into Honda's soul here. This is what he wanted the United Nations, the world, to be like. This is what he was hoping would happen. I think that, honestly, the United Nations, as it appears in this film, is what he wanted, and I think what most people kind of wanted when the United Nations became a thing.
There was a lot of hope at the beginning, yeah.
Lots of hope. And, I mean, the United Nations had been around for a while by the time 1959 rolled around. But, again, that feeling of there's still potential in this idea of a United Nations. I mean, it's called the United Nations. Shouldn't we be able to put these differences aside and erase borders for the greater good of mankind, the Brotherhood of Man? And in Honda's fantasy worlds, and even his science fiction fantasy worlds, this is something that's a given. This is something that's going to happen. And it really, and again, it's been talked about it in more depth in, many other places before. But for my money, this is the epitome of Honda's filmic vision of what kind of world he wanted to see. It's very effective, and it's heavy-handed without feeling like it's kind of, like, at least for my money, that it's smacking you over the head. It is kind of smacking you over the head, but it's such a good idea, and it's such a positive outlook that you can't fault Honda for putting it in the film to the degree that he put it in.
No.
The heavy-handedness of saying, this thing is coming, we have to, without blinking, put our differences aside and protect our planet where we, mankind, live. Not this kind of person lives on this half of the planet, and then this person over here, and this people. No, we are mankind. We come together. We do what we have to do. And this is the strongest of all of his films for me, where he delivered that message. And as strong as it is, as heavy-handed as it is, it never crosses the line into, like, ham-fisted.
No.
Like some people, I've used that word pop up for Hedorah before, Yoshimitsu Banno's Godzilla vs. Hedorah. And, but honest, like, and again, the with Battle in Outer Space and Honda's very, very optimistic outlook on mankind's future, you can't fault the guy for going there.
No, you don't want to fault him for his idealism. No,
certainly not. Like it comes through in this film really, really well. And the again, like right at the end with the people protesting and Ifukube's music is blaring up, and it makes you want to go fight the aliens while you're watching the movie. It's an effective moment.
It really ramps up the excitement. Actually, it prepares you for the final act to the movie, which is the final part of this movie is fantastic. It's so good. It's a tokusatsu extravaganza. It's very impressive.
Yes, it is.
We have our dogfight in space, which is nice. And it does a good job at helping us to realize that using all of those lasers as weapons is about as effective and difficult as World War I dogfighting.
Yeah,
with bullets in the air, because the speeds would probably be so high. It would be pretty amazing. Like if we had an actual cockpit view of what was going on there, it would be almost impossible to try to hit anything. But
I think so.
Yeah. So it's instead of just like there's this targeting system and then you just press the button and you shoot it and it's done. That probably wouldn't be very easy to do. So at least it wasn't like just I destroyed 50 fighters, or whatever. It's super easy.
You can tell it doesn't work like that, man. There's a lot of World War I dogfight in this in this sequence, and it is the battle in outer space of the title, and it's so like when you get to that moment, it pays off in so many ways. The launching alone, if you look at the rockets, like the little bits that are holding them down, and then they blast off and the parts separate. All done in miniature, just beautiful. And then when you get into space, it's so cool. And and again, watching this film as many times as I have, it really makes the case for me that if George Lucas didn't watch this film before making Star Wars, I'd be shocked.
I was going to mention that. You can tell. I'd say you can tell. Yeah. I mean, Spielberg, he saw movies like Lost Horizon, and that's how we got Indiana Jones. There are all kinds of things that great directors in America have seen, whether it's Japanese or European films, or there are all kinds of little things. I mean, obviously, then also with George Lucas and The Hidden Fortress. I mean, there you go.
Yes, but George Lucas's love for Japanese film is very well documented, and so I've never read anything one way or another that confirmed that he saw this film or took inspiration from it. But looking at just the sequences where the camera is facing the pilot, and you can see space on either side of them over their shoulder outside. And they have their helmets on with their visors, and they're saying, "Hey, I'm moving in for the kill." Just those scenes alone, and then the one moment where the guy flinches and then his ship blows up. Mm-hmm. I'm just watching it thinking, "Stay on target."
Yeah,
it is so similar.
The way that it's filmed. Yeah.
The way that it's filmed, like the sequence itself stands like in, let's just say A New Hope, for example. Let's just say the original Star Wars and Battle in Outer Space. Those battles are very different, but when you boil it down to how it was shot, they're filmed very, very similarly with two entirely different techniques, which is impressive. I mean, we're talking, motion control in 1977, and then a solid 18 years earlier than that. I mean, the spaceships are all on wires, and the dynamic movement that you can get out of these things was unbelievable. And it was combined with shots of the insides of the rockets, and it's very Star Wars like. It is very, very Star Wars like. And again, I have no confirmation one way or another that any kind of link between those two films does exist. But knowing Lucas's penchant for loving Japanese film, I don't know. Maybe it's the conspiracy theorist in me, but I see connections there, and I think any Star Wars fan who watches Battle in Outer Space would see it too very easily. So I think it's definitely possible.
The torpedoes, these space torpedoes, and we've seen these earlier in the movie too, when they were shooting them at the Speeps when they're trying to get to the moon. And they're these sort of football-shaped missiles in this attack. The mothership is there, and then they're sort of the way that they carry them is they sort of levitate the torpedoes along with them as they're flying. Like they're not even inside the ship. It's actually something that they're carrying on the outside. But there are two of these torpedoes at the end, and one of them hits the Golden Gate Bridge, and one of them hits New York City. And Manhattan looks like in the middle of Midtown. Both of those special effects sequences are fantastic. I especially like the bridge, because the bridge falls apart in the absolute most right way possible. It looks so good. Yeah, there's no way that you could do that again and have it look differently, and it would, and not be able to. You wouldn't be able to get to the original one. Like it just is perfect.
No,
it looks
it
so
was
real.
Really, really good. I'm actually shocked that those moments never wound up as stock footage in like 70s Godzilla films because of all that. I've always wondered about that. Like some of those shots are just amazing. I mean, footage from Rodan and the Mysterians ended up in 70s Godzilla films, grainy in a different aspect ratio, but they didn't. This movie is full, beautiful color Toho scope, and I find it amazing that they didn't at least use a couple of snippets of some of these moments in the film, especially like you said, the bridge with the little cars that are driving, and then they flip and fall off. And they're tiny. I don't know how they did it. It's amazing. I love watching these films and thinking, my God, how did they, like, it's perfect. Mm-hmm. Like, how did they do this? And it's all hand manufactured, and it's got a weight to it and a realisticness to it that if you tried to do it with CG today, and I mean, God knows how many times the Golden Gate Bridge has been destroyed in film or similar bridges. I mean, just a few years earlier, Harryhausen's giant octopus pulled it down.
Oh, and, that's right.
Yeah. It was, so it has had a history. I find, which is interesting, because they had to get those shot in. It came from beneath the sea with the giant octopus. They had to get those shots in secret, because the city fathers in San Francisco were worried that if the bridge was depicted being torn down by an octopus, and it was recently opened at that point, if it had the audiences saw it being torn down by an octopus, they wouldn't think it was a safe bridge. They would have questions about like, and Harryhausen used to laugh about this in interviews, because he would say, well, we put a camera into the back of a bread truck and drove back and forth to get the plates for the animation, and we took them back, and I animated the octopus, and the city fathers never complained. And he always used to say, I doubt we ever scared anybody into thinking that the Golden Gate Bridge was unsafe should an octopus show up and try to pull it down. I always think of that when I see Battle in Outer Space, because I wonder, like, would these same people say, no, you can't film there because people might be scared that an alien torpedo might hit it and blow it up.
Yeah, I think they're really trying to cover their bases a little bit too much.
A little bit too much.
Realm of possibility.
That movie's, And again, that that bridge has been in so many movies now that I think they gave up on it pretty quick.
One of my favorites is the original Superman from 1978.
Oh, yes.
It just looks so good, too. But
it did look good.
Destroy All Monsters, actually. We keep going back to this, but the part where they show all the cars driving in Tokyo and everything before that scene happens, glorious attack on Tokyo occurs.
Oh, yes.
But that was also just absolute pinnacle of detail, getting all the cars moving and just having all this stuff going on at the same time. It's just very incredible. But the New York part's great too, though. Going right into Manhattan and causing all that destruction.
Oh yeah.
Then we get the mother of all destruction, and that's when the mothership actually goes down to Tokyo and just starts absolute zeroing everything and tearing it apart into pieces, and including including that movie theater. I'm pretty sure that the movie theater had to have been one of the places that they showed this movie.
I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure.
I bet more likely than not. Yeah, and then I suppose, well, if you're in that exact theater and you're watching this movie, you're like, oh wow, it just destroyed the theater that we're in. Like, it's just, I have never been to a movie theater and had that happen. It would be pretty cool if it did, though. Just be like, oh, we're in there. It's just
something similar did happen with the original Godzilla when the monster smacks the Nichigeki theater with its tail, and apparently there were some people that kind of wigged out in the theater when that was shown in '54. They were like, "Oh my God, what's happening?" And the closest it's never happened to me either. The closest I ever got was when I visited Tokyo in 2016 to see Shin Godzilla. We drove through the Aqualine tunnel that he cracks through at the beginning, and drove over the bridge that he throws.
Yeah.
Which is the same bridge from 54. And he's just so much bigger now that he doesn't just tear it down, he just throws it. And so we drove over this bridge, and underneath the Aqualine, we were watching the movie, and then we did this, and we were like, oh my God, like that's crazy. And it was opening day for the film too, and it was like, oh my, what is going on here? It was like surreal. If the theater I was seeing the movie in had been destroyed while I was watching it, I don't know like how surreal that would have been, because just knowing I had been in the Aqualine and I drove over the bridge, and I went to see the Wako building, the famous clock tower that Godzilla knocks over, and that gets totally wrecked in Shin Godzilla 2.
Yes.
And I just kept having these moments where I was like, my God, I was there like a couple hours ago. But I'd love to be in a theater as the theater's getting destroyed in a movie I'm watching one of these days, because I can only imagine how crazy that would be. But
that'd be fun.
It would be fun. It would be fun. The theater and all of those set pieces that get destroyed are so detailed, especially when you consider that they weren't made out of the typical miniature materials at the time.
Yeah, and at the beginning of the Tokyo sequence, they show a sort of skyline view, but then they have this mural behind the actual buildings. Then they have the mural behind them showing way more buildings behind that. But it looks so good that just seeing it for that long, you almost couldn't tell. It looked that good.
No, yeah. And that's the effectiveness of a truly good matte painting, is that it's used exactly where, how, and for how long it needs to be to make the illusion effective, and then it goes away. Like towards the beginning of the film with the Earth, the painting of the Earth, and it's that great shot. It's the horizon line as it's starting to shrink, and you can still see the country. Yeah. That painting is on screen for seconds, and it's beautiful, and then it goes away, and you don't see it again. The Tokyo skyline in this is beautiful as well, and I think it was probably done that way to A, to make the city look big, B, to save money, and C, because of the fans that they used on set, because they did actually blow those buildings straight up with compressed air.
There's really no other way you could do that.
No, yeah, it's been erroneously reported before that they built the sets upside down and then destroyed them with wires and pulled it. No,
that's not what I saw.
How that works. Nope. No, I think anybody who's actually seen the film knows that is super not how they did it.
Yeah.
Like so much, there's been so much misinformation out there, ever since these films first came out, that sometimes things just get repeated. And I mean, God knows there are people that still think Kong kicked Godzilla's butt in *62, and or Godzilla kicked Kong's butt in the Japanese version, and that thing is still it's still a rumor that people buy. It's crazy, but yeah, when you watch this film, it's that destruction is amazing, and the way that they ended up doing it, which is the one time that the awful, and again talking about rumors, the trigger warning, cardboard buildings, which every time I hear that, I just want to like smack my head against a wall. I can tell you 2 times in tokusatsu history that I know where cardboard was used. The other being Ultraman Powered in the early 90s, which was shot in America, and the Japanese guys showed up and they were like, "What are you doing? Why are these buildings cardboard?" And they were like, "Well, we thought that's how it was done." And the Japanese guys had to basically kick the American special effects team out and be like, "Okay, this is insulting. This is how it's actually done." They rolled up their sleeves and built actual buildings, but they had to film with the buildings that they had. So if you watch the first episode of the Ultraman Powered, the buildings just look like garbage. But that wasn't the fault of anybody from Japan doing these effects. The only time in an actual Japanese production that I'm aware of that I know cardboard was definitely used was this scene, because you can't blow heavy plaster and little tiny bits of masonry up with the fan. That's just not going to happen. So they use paper thin, cardboard and wafers to construct the buildings. And the fact that you can watch these scenes and your first thought isn't, "Oh, that's cardboard." Like the buildings look like normal, regular miniature sets.
Yeah.
The fact that they did use cardboard and it looked that good, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like super duper amazing. And, the matting in of the little guys flailing as they shoot up into the sky and putting it all together just looked amazing.
If you were on ground level, you'd be terrified.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, I mean it's yeah.
If they did that with CGI, you'd see how truly, absolutely frightening that would be to experience that, or even to see it from a distance. Because it'd just be catastrophic, the amount of damage done in such a small amount of time.
And the fact that I like movies and things like in disaster films where you're basically watching a city almost destroying itself. Rodan did a similar thing where all Rodan had to do in that first 56 film was fly over the buildings, and the buildings tore themselves down. Human infrastructure tore itself down, and the aliens don't have to do much else other than activate zero gravity with their absolute zero cannon, and up go the buildings in little chunks. It's terrifying.
There are a lot of movies that are related to this that happened after this, because this is pretty early for a movie like this to occur.
Yeah.
With this kind of a story, and let alone the effects. But I've seen plenty of movies since this, and then there's movies like Armageddon. This is sort of similar to this, because Armageddon, quite a bit of that was focused on action, and it's focused on the events. And that's how a lot of disaster movies are. Yeah. But yeah,
you were given your ensemble group of characters, and you didn't really know them that well, but they were your excuse to get to the set pieces, to the action.
You can tell that this got the ball rolling in many respects for what people expect and what you sort of want to see in a story like this.
Exactly. There weren't, I mean, space movies were coming out left and right at this time, but very few of them had the kind of epic scale and a sense of seriousness and the budget and the scope that this film was going for. The 2 biggest ones that I can think of are, as we've mentioned before, Destination Moon from George Powell and Forbidden Planet. Other than that, most other stories like this were very, very low budget. I'm thinking something like the Rocky Jones Space Ranger television series from the 50s, which famously got turned into 2 Mystery Science Theater movies. I love that stuff, because it's basically like they copied and pasted the rockets. You know what I mean? Yeah. They're fun to watch. I love me a good rocket ship movie, but
and then you wonder what could they have done if they had a really good budget.
Yes.
And,
What
and
could
then
they
finally
have
that
done
nagging
indeed?
feeling in your head is erased because you get to see this. But yeah.
Yeah, and exactly. It's like, what would this look like on a budget? Oh, it's Battle in Outer Space. Like that's, if somebody said, we're going to take the rocket ships seriously, we're going to take the science seriously, then you get something very much like Destination Moon or Battle in Outer Space. George Pal set out to do Destination Moon to do something that was very, very plausible from the mid-50s point of view. And so in that respect, it's very similar to Battle in Outer Space, but Battle in Outer Space has the added benefit of like the full, and again, it's not fantasy, as much fantasy as the Mysterians would have been, but there's just something very unique about the way that Battle in Outer Space was handled with the full, the colors, the cars with their, the golds, the yellow, the yellow and the red cars. Like that's something that's very, very exotic and cool, but it still looked like it had a function, and it's something that could have been designed. I'm sure that when this film came out, people were probably saying, oh, Battle in Outer Space ripped off Destination Moon, but it couldn't be farther from the case. This is not something. And when I watch Battle in Outer Space, I don't think Destination Moon when I watch it. I don't think this is a response to that. I think like when we were talking about the Three Treasures, you can watch it and it's in the back of your mind. Well, this is a response to Ten Commandments, which it was. It still feels like its own thing. Battle in Outer Space feels even more like its own thing. It doesn't feel like it was trying to copy anybody else. It doesn't feel like it was trying to cash in on anything else. It is its own very, very cool kind of an experiment, because it took the ideas and the concepts and the talent, the skills that had made 1954 up through 1959 so profitable for, special effects films, and they were continuing to refine things, and they took the elements that made Godzilla and Rodan and Varan and the Mysterians work so well, and they did a space opera. They did a war film in space. At the end of the day, it's in that way, it's not very comparable to a lot of films. It has elements that are definitely shared, but it stands alone very nicely, I think.
It feels like an end point. It's like the logical end to a whole bunch of different things that had been done up to that point, which I guess it doesn't make this movie experimental as much as it just does everything well and puts everything together for the first time. Like everything's all working so nicely in concert with everything else.
This is a firing on all cylinders movie for sure. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned it in our Three Treasures episode, where if you look at let's isolate just the optical effects from the Mysterians. They're beautiful, but they're not as refined as you might get in a later film from the, even in Battle in Outer Space and going on upwards from there. The lasers and the blasts and the fires coming out of the rockets when it was optical instead of an actual fire on set. Things like that. That's 1957. 1959, 2 years later, it feels like the more experimental effects in the Mysterians, because before that they hadn't really done optical. They hadn't done optical lasers and Mogera shooting bolts of energy out of its eyes. 2 years later, Battle in Outer Space feels like it was made by absolute pros, which it was, and the Mysterians was made by pros too. But in that amount of time, they had refined what they were doing, and they were firing on all cylinders. Ifukube's music is great. The effects are just outstanding. And Ifukube is awesome in The Mysterians, and the effects are wonderful in The Mysterians as well. But in that 2 years, you can feel that a change has happened. And by the time you get to Battle in Outer Space, it looks like you're watching something that's been made by a team that's been doing this for like a decade or two.
And even 10 years after this, not much had technologically changed with the things you could use to make a movie like this. The tools were still there. They pretty much hit their point. Yeah. And so this was, a lot of the time, this could have been 10 years ahead of its time, because a lot of stuff after this wasn't as good as this.
It's true. And of course, a lot of that was down to the changing of the Japanese film landscape and, shifts behind the scenes and such. But
11 really, years after this, we're in trouble. But
we started getting in big trouble. But they had the opportunity to do it in 1959 and really do it well and just create something remarkably unique. And really, a lot of those effects didn't get refined that much further going forward. I mean, there's definitely improvements here and there, but I don't think like spaceships, for example, like the Speeps, I don't think that rocket ships going forward looked any better than they did in Battle in Outer Space. I mean, they looked just as good in the best cases, like all the Moonlight SY-3, for example, from Destroy All Monsters, is gorgeous. It's on par with Battle in Outer Space.
It is.
The Spaceship P-1 from Monster Zero, on par. Yeah. Not better, certainly not worse. But it's about at that same level. And it's crazy to think that they, like, the tokusatsu as a genre, as we know it, they would experimented with it before, but as we know it, launched in 1954, and just half a decade later, they had already done so much and they'd perfected so much, and these things would continue to be worked on and tweaked as it went along. But in 5 years, an entire genre's worth of special effects techniques had been pretty much brought to their peak. That's amazing.
And it sort of explains the stagnation of the 70s later, too. It's sort of like we don't have anything new to use, really. It's just more of the same. Obviously, Battle in Outer Space, The Mysterians, movies like this, that was a lot of man-hours and time and just detail. And the detail is the aspect that I think is, if you start to get tired, the detail is what goes first. And all of this extreme good amount of energy that everybody had.
Yeah, and again, that's very, very true, where you just have, the details start to go, and that's how you get movies, like, we'll take definitely the 70s Godzilla films as examples, where you get remarkably fun, entertaining, wonderful movies, but they don't have the care put into them that the earlier ones did. And that doesn't make them bad movies, it just makes them different. They're of a different era. And I love those films to death. But when you look at the effects for, I'll pull Megalon out of thin air, and then you go back to Battle in Outer Space. We're talking about a movie, two movies that are separated by nearly a decade and a half, and it's clear to see which one has the more sophisticated effects, which is, not surprising considering Megalon took most of its effects from other movies. It took the more detailed ones, the buildings being destroyed. They didn't film. They filmed the dam blowing up, but everything else was from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Monster Zero. All the monsters, they took that stuff, which was still from the peak, and they spliced it in. It's amazing just to think that much happened that quickly, and then from there it plateaued. And then it started to go down. It went very, very quick.
That concludes part 2, and now I'll move on to the related topic. You're listening to KVR Kaijuvision Radio. In part 3 of the podcast, I will be analyzing a topic that was either brought up in the film or was going on at the time of the film's release. And the topic I chose for this episode is the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. I chose this topic because this was what was going on when the film was released. Japan wasn't much of a player in the space race at this time, but the US and the Soviet Union were the big two for a very long period of time. What I'll do first is I'll describe a sort of overview of what's going on, and then I will go into the specifics of the space race, basically between 1957 and 1969. So this is the race to put a man on the moon. A lot of the politics in the space program started with John Kennedy. Reasons for why Kennedy did this include a lot of things. The missile gap with Russia, which is the arms race. And this was an arms race for both ICBMs and the rocket propulsion technology that delivered them. The Bay of Pigs debacle and failure, it made the president look incompetent. It was quite a big failure. It was badly executed. Also, the Soviet Union launching Sputnik and the Yuri Gagarin flight in 1961. And this made the U.S. perceive that they were behind in the space race, which they were. And the Sputnik actually caused the Sputnik crisis in 1957 because it showed just how drastically America was behind at the time. So in other words, winning the space race means winning a battle of perception. If you win the space race, then that equals superior military power. It's looked at as the ultimate extra aspect of technological achievement. It's also more influence over the Third World and the non-aligned countries by achieving all of these goals, rather than the other side doing it. It's sort of like, see, we did this, yeah, we're stronger than they are. And then see who did this first, we're smarter than they are. We have a bigger doomsday bomb than them, well, that matters, and that's why the arms race happened. The big main idea here is prestige, and international prestige. The US had Western Europe, and the Soviet Union had Eastern Europe. Many other countries were not allied with either side, but the Cold War created pressure for them to take sides, so perception was everything. President Kennedy said that we needed to go to the moon first, and he raised the budget of the space program significantly. There was even some people wondering in America if the Soviets would change their behavior if we beat them to the moon, because the perceptions battle would be lost by them, and so how much mileage do you get out of perceptions? Well, it couldn't hurt to try. So there's international politics all surrounding the space program. The Cold War, the arms race, technological superiority race, prestige is at stake. The space race was a product of the environment at the time. The height of the Cold War was in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and again in 1983, with a lot of the events regarding NATO and all these other things that occurred, and that was the backdrop for the 1984 return of Godzilla. And again, well, right now, too, we're having a lot of problems with international tensions. Throughout the space race, the two sides were messing with each other regarding what they were doing until something successful happened. There were many failures as the science got refined, but they would also disguise what a launch was, or they would put out false information. You want to hide the development and tests of this stuff until your big achievement occurs. So in 1957, the launch of Sputnik scared the crap out of the Americans. There is no limit to how important this was, because Sputnik went over the Earth 4 times at 18,000 miles per hour. The Soviets had done this before. It was an observational tool, but you can put an observation tool over the enemy. That's the point. And when there are two entities vying for dominance, the result is an unstable binary system. In a bipolar world, there are two hegemons, and they violently went around the world from one country to another country, having all of these proxy battles. Well, this has continued to this day. If they win, you lose. It's a zero-sum game. Every time you lose prestige. And by the way, everyone else on Earth is watching and keeping score and deciding who to ally with. It's a huge propaganda war. Rocketry went from just missiles to satellite deliveries. They started using rockets for now all these satellites. Now, the Germans were very good with rocketry. There were lots of scientists and experts. Regarding the Germans, the American press, who reported on the space race, they came up with a joke that was a running joke, and it was our Germans versus their Germans, meaning the Soviets' Germans. Werner von Braun was one of the German scientists that came to America to work on spaceflight. In December of 1959, the month that this movie was released, was when NASA started putting monkeys into capsules and sending them into space. Primates were, and still are, often used as test subjects, specifically chimpanzees. The monkey in the test in 1959 went 280,000 feet into the air and experienced zero gravity for a couple of minutes and then came back unharmed. America lagged behind the Soviets. The Soviets had Sputnik, the first satellite. They had the first pictures of the dark side of the moon. They got the first dog into space, the first probe to impact the moon, and the first probe into solar orbit. However, the U.S. had the first solar-powered satellite, the first communications satellite, the first weather satellite, and the first photo of Earth from orbit, and the first imaging weather satellite. Then the effort moved to the next step, to put a human into space. There are some important ideological aspects to the space race. The Soviets gave their cosmonauts almost no control inside these vehicles that they sent up in these capsules, while the Americans gave astronauts as much control as possible. The Americans' thought process was, we're not up there, they're the only ones that can be up there, and only they can judge what is the very best to do when it's a split-second decision. The Soviet system, which devalued the individual, was that only the controllers of the craft on the ground should have control because they're the experts, so the guy in the capsule may as well be a chimpanzee. The two manned spaceflight programs in the two hegemons were Mercury for the US and Vostok for the USSR. Mercury was a bell-shaped capsule designed to land in the ocean upon re-entry, and Vostok was a circular capsule designed to land on the ground. This training process for these astronauts and cosmonauts was extremely intense. The job of choosing who to end up with is not easy. You had to select a perfect specimen, strong, high endurance, and smart. There was sensory deprivation and all kinds of other tests that were done on them, including zero-gravity training. In 1961, there was a chimpanzee flight where the chimp had to pull levers and look at lights while the flight was going into space and back down. If the chimp messed up, he'd get an electrical shock to his feet, and if he did everything right, he would get a banana pellet. So if he did this all right, and it was assumed that a human could too, the chimp only got shocked a couple of times in this test, and he did what he had been training for. He landed in the ocean and was recovered in great condition. However, the U.S. was not the first country to send a man into space. The first man in space was Yuri Gagarin on April 12, 1961. He was on a Vostok 1 capsule, and he orbited the Earth once. He was made a larger-than-life figure, a true hero. The Bay of Pigs failure was right after the flight of Yuri Gagarin, and that was another slap in the face to the Kennedy administration. On May 5, 1961, less than a month later, Mercury Redstone 3 was the mission that made Alan Shepard the first American in space. Redstone was the rocket that launched the Mercury 7 into space. He went 116.5 miles into the air, and the flight lasted about 15 minutes, while the Russian flight had lasted for 108 minutes. The U.S. one was the first pilot-controlled space flight for a human. After both nations had done the manned space flight, the next objective was to land on the moon. In 1963, the Soviet Union was the first country to put a woman into space, and she was also the first civilian in space. Her name was Valentina Tereshkova, and that was on a Vostok 6 mission. After both nations had done the manned spaceflight, the next objective was to land a man on the moon. The idea was also that the winner would do this before 1970. Kennedy himself said, before the decade is out. And the Gemini program began. 2 men in the spacecraft, hence the name Gemini. Gemini 3 was the first piloted orbit change. In that test, they were able to use thrusters to change the shape and the altitude of their orbit. Gemini 5 was to have a long enough spaceflight to last the time that it would take for a craft to go to the moon and back, which is about 8 days. Both Gemini 3 and 5 took place in 1965. Gemini 6A and 7 were the first 2 craft to rendezvous but not dock, though if they had been equipped to dock, they could have. So these are all the steps that it takes to be able to put humans on the moon. You have to do all of these missions and be able to progress to the next step each time, so make sure that you can do it. In 1966, there was the first spacecraft docking, which was Gemini 8. As these missions become bigger and more complex, larger rockets were needed in order to be able to get the larger payloads into orbit. The next thing to do was to have a successful EVA, or extravehicular activity, that proves that you can do work in space. America did this in late 1966 with a 5.5-hour-long EVA activity. Apollo 8 was a big milestone. It occurred in 1968. That was the first human spaceflight that left Earth's orbit and orbited the moon and then came back home. This was to demonstrate that's all that's left to do is to land a craft on the moon and then take back off again. They were the first ones to see Earth from the moon, and this was the famous Earthrise photo that was taken back then. There is in fact a mural in this movie when they're on the moon and they see Earth from a distance, and it looks pretty close. The journey took 2.8 days to get there. They orbited the moon 10 times. The crew actually broadcasted on Christmas and read the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis. This was a hugely watched event on television. Apollo 11 was the big one. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. They were on the moon for 21.5 hours. They had used a Saturn V rocket to get enough propulsion to get to the moon. The whole mission lasted 8 days. This was not only the first humans on the moon, but also the first launch from another celestial body besides Earth. They landed in the Sea of Tranquility on the moon. They needed a smooth landing area, among other things. This was a 3-man mission, one to command, one to pilot the command module, and one to pilot the lunar module. 1 million people watched Apollo 11 launch from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It's not unlike the scene of this movie where the astronauts get such a brilliant and honorable send-off. They landed and they made their first steps onto the moon's surface, where Armstrong said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Armstrong does say that he did say amen, but maybe the word got kind of swallowed. They walked around in the 1/6 gravity of the moon, and they got a soil sample, and they collected moon soil to bring back. They also planted the U.S. flag there. There was the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and that prohibited territorial claims on the moon. So there was never controversy about having the American flag planted and if that represented any claim or not, because it didn't. This was about national pride, and that was what we were going for in the first place almost. However, there was a lot of feeling that the U.S. was doing this on behalf of all of humanity. The plaque that goes with the flag reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Nixon himself said, "As we explore the reaches of space, let us go to the new worlds together, not as new worlds to be conquered, but as a new adventure to be shared." The astronauts also called President Nixon at the White House from the moon. The flag that they planted was blown down when they launched to return home, so in future missions they knew to have the flag far enough away. It is actually in the 1965 film Invasion of Astro Monster, where there is a triple flag planting, which is the United States, Japan, and the United Nations. The biggest part of the space race was over at this point, because the goal had been achieved. The U.S. had triumphed, and they were the ones who got the prestige and the admiration for this achievement. Now the latest goal is to send a man to Mars while using the moon as a launch point. It would take 8 months to get to Mars, so it will be an incredible endeavor to accomplish. NASA is going to send equipment to the moon next year and in 2020. A human trip to the moon would happen in approximately 2023. Either a lunar base or an orbiting gateway station would be built. Then the mission to Mars would begin from there. Given that tensions are high in the world right now, I'm not sure how much cooperation there will be internationally with this mission to Mars. However, there is a pretty long tradition that has developed with the International Space Station that made cooperation easier, and that may count for something. It would be a good idea to pool funding and scientific knowledge because this will be a fairly risky and costly project. There will also be private companies like Boeing and SpaceX that will likely cooperate with NASA. The riskier NASA missions are, the more sense it makes to send robots instead of humans. Losing a robot is a lot less bad PR than losing an entire crew or even one crew member. In the missions with the chimpanzees, NASA treated them as crew. They were important lives to keep safe. So doing all of this with humans is much more of a high-stakes operation, which adds to all of the excitement and the drama that ends up getting caught up in all of this. This film doesn't portray the space race, per se. It portrays what the world could and should be doing. It's an idealistic interpretation. Now, how did this film express the Japanese national spirit? Well, in this movie, Japan is in a major leadership position in the future. They're a powerful participant in the international community, and they are a gathering point for nations at the space program headquarters, which is there. So this is a lot like Destroy All Monsters, in that in Destroy All Monsters, it was Japanese technology that saved the day, and it showed Japan's technological supremacy. Well, a lot of this is sort of the same thing. And it shows Japan being a very important country, very smart, very critical to the rest of the world, and it shows them at the forefront of leadership in the world community. So this is very important. It shows Japan and what they are aspiring to be. That isn't just what Ishiro Honda is aspiring for. That's what a lot of Japanese were aspiring for at the time. There are no GDP figures until 1960. So once we get to the next movie, we'll be able to start reciting those figures. Daniel, thank you again for coming on to be a guest co-host for the show today. It was really good talking with you about this really unique, awesome movie that I'm glad I was able to make sure got into this season.
Yeah, I'm thank you so much for having me to talk about it. Like I said before, this is one of my favorite movies. This is one of my favorite projects that Toho has ever done, and it's. I've never been scared away by, no monster in it. You know what I mean? That's certainly not a deterrent for me. I love this film, and it doesn't get talked about a lot in the United States, probably mostly because it doesn't have the allure of the monster in it. But it's a film that deserves to be seen. It's a film that deserves to be experienced, is a good word, because this is an experience of a film. It sounds beautiful. It looks beautiful. It comes highly recommended from me, definitely. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come and gush about how much I love this movie. It was definitely a fun time. Now I kind of want to go watch it again, if I'm being perfectly honest. I love this movie a lot.
Yeah, I enjoyed rewatching this too. It doesn't really get old. It's just good fun. It gets it goes all the places it needs to.
Exactly.
And Daniel is at the Godzilla Novelization Project, and it is GodzillaNovelizationProject.wordpress.com, and that's the site. And you can look at all of his novelizations of so many of these Godzilla movies that he has started working on. And they are all in various stages of development, and some of them are further on than others. You're sort of going from like one to the other, and I can understand why you would want to do that instead of doing one all at once. But it's a very intriguing project, and putting these into novelizations is something that I think, and this is all of the Godzilla movies from Japan, just to clarify that. Those are the ones that you're working on. It's really amazing. What I have read is just wonderful. And
Thank you, man.
It's so awesome that you're doing this project.
I'm having an absolute blast doing it. It is a massive undertaking, but I'm having so much fun. I have so much respect for these films, aside from just enjoying them. And this is something that doesn't exist in English. There are adaptations that exist in Japanese, but nothing in English. This is something I've wanted to do for a very, very long time, and it's going really well so far. I've gotten wonderful feedback from you and from other fans and friends that have really enjoyed what I've done so far, and I hope that I can continue to entertain people, create something that for free, I might add, that's definitely something that the Godzilla fan community can enjoy and get behind, and help me to continue doing. It's just been so much fun, super duper fulfilling too. So I can't wait to keep going, and I thank you again for your support of my project going forward.
This episode is dedicated to the immortal, the great Eiji Tsuburaya, the master of special effects from the Showa era Godzilla and Showa era tokusatsu films. A giant among people who are affiliated with the Godzilla movies, and his work is so well showcased in this movie. I decided to dedicate this episode to him.
Very, very appropriate. This is a good one to dedicate to him. They didn't call him Tokusatsu no Kami, the god of special effects, for no reason. He's a man who's who gave a lot of kids dreams, kids of all ages all over the world, and a man whose imagination could barely be contained by the films that he made. Just a man of incredible power, storytelling, visually, just a man to be in awe of. And he and his team created a lot of wonder in this world during his lifetime, and still do to this day. I would not be who I am without Tsuburaya-san's influence on my life, on my art, on my just on the person I am. And so here's to you, old man, as they used to call him. And I hope wherever he is now, he's looking down and thinking, man, look at all of the wonderful dreams that I helped sow in generations of people.
Yeah, and still today, still going.
Today.
You got to be proud of that. It's just amazing.
I'm happy to be to be part of the family, I guess you could say. Like all Godzilla fans, we all understand something. We understand what he was trying to communicate through what he was creating on screen in terms of his visual effects and his stories and his ideas. He was speaking a language that we understand, and some people don't understand it, and to each their own, but we understood what he was trying to say and how he was trying to say it. And we saw something and continue to see something beautiful in what he communicated. And what he communicated is so powerful and so universal that it's going to continue to communicate with children of all ages, future generations. Doesn't matter what language you speak, here in America, in Japan, anywhere in the world. What he created, what he birthed, what he put into this world will continue, and it will continue to spread wonder, a sense of wonder and beauty and inspiration. And it doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter how old you are. This man's work speaks to our hearts, and it will continue to do that until the end of time. I fully believe that.
Very well said.
Thank you.
The next episode of this podcast will be 1961's The Last War. And this is another non-kaiju movie that is still tokusatsu, though, that will be covered in this season. There are a few movies that are either disaster movies or they're like the next one, where it's sort of a disaster movie, yeah.
Sort of a disaster movie. More of a war film.
Yeah.
More of the consequences of war film.
The World War II was bad, but the next one, if we do have one, is going to be a doozy. That kind of thing.
Yeah. It's the film that basically took the premise behind Godzilla and removed the metaphor of the monster. So if that gives you an indication of how brutal and heart-wrenching this film is, just stay tuned. It is a powerful, effective movie, and it's definitely going to be a fun one to have dissected, because again, it's not talked about that much in the United States, but it definitely deserves attention.
Yeah, and me having to do with NATO and everything, I've been able to study the idea of nuclear war and all of that quite a lot through the lens of NATO and the two alliances that are in this movie next time, that they're pretty much stand-ins for NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
Exactly.
It's extremely interesting and scary would be the word, too.
It's a very scary film.
It's a pretty scary movie.
It is. There are moments where you're just like, oh my God, please no. It's truly terrifying.
Yeah. I'd like to send a shout out to our patron, Sean Stiff. Thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. He donated at the Kaiju Visionary level, and donating is worth it. You get the inside track to what is going on with the show. You get to message me personally, and it's extremely fun to talk with listeners who are enjoying what's being produced this season. If you'd like to send some feedback, I'd love to hear from you. The email address is feedback@kaijuvision.com. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Kaijuvision Radio is available on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, YouTube with scenic videos, and on kaijuvision.com. If you like the podcast, please donate on Patreon. I'm Brian Scherschel.
I'm Daniel DiManna.
And this is KVR, Kaijuvision Radio. See you next time.